Beneath the shifting sands of the Sahara and the suffocating canopy of the Amazon lies a history we barely recognize. We pride ourselves on modern progress, yet we stand dwarfed by the silent enigmas of our ancestors. How did the ancients move stones, weighing hundreds of tons with surgical precision? Why do disparate civilizations, separated by vast oceans and millennia, share the same celestial alignments and serpent myths? Perhaps we are not the pinnacle of human achievement, but a sequel to a story we have forgotten how to read. Are these ruins mere tombs, or are they blueprints of a lost science? Every megalith is a question mark carved in granite. Every sunken city is a whisper from a world that knew secrets we are only beginning to rediscover. What if the darkness of the past is actually a blinding light we aren't yet ready to see? Across the vast emptiness of Pakistan's Cholistan Desert, where the horizon dissolves into waves of sand and heat, a colossal fortress rises abruptly from the landscape. Its walls stretch in perfect geometric symmetry, towering above the desert floor, as if guarding something long forgotten. For travelers approaching across the dunes, the sight can feel almost unreal. 40 immense bastions, forming a massive square citadel, visible from kilometers away. This is Derawar Fort, one of the most imposing desert fortresses ever constructed in South Asia. Yet despite its dramatic presence, the true story of why such an enormous stronghold was built in such a remote and desolate region remains only partially understood. Archaeologists, historians, and explorers continue to debate its origins, its strategic purpose, and the deeper history hidden beneath its walls. Like many ancient monuments scattered across the world's deserts, Derawar Fort raises a simple but unsettling question. What once existed here that required a fortress of such extraordinary scale? Historical records suggest that the earliest version of Derawar Fort was built during the 9th century by a Rajput ruler known as Rai Jajabati. According to regional chronicles, the fortress originally bore the name Dera Rawal, meaning the settlement or stronghold of Rawal. Positioned along the shifting frontier zones of early medieval kingdoms, the fort may have served as a defensive outpost, guarding the desert approaches between Sindh, Rajasthan, and the fertile Indus plains. Over time, control of the region passed through numerous powers, including Rajput clans, regional Muslim dynasties, and eventually the Abbasid rulers of Bahawalpur. The fortress that dominates the desert today largely reflects major reconstructions carried out in the 18th century by Nawab Sadiq Muhammad Khan of Bahawalpur. Under his rule, the old defensive structure was rebuilt and dramatically expanded into the immense citadel visible today. Although Derawar Fort has existed in historical memory for centuries, systematic documentation by modern scholars began during the 19th century, when British colonial surveyors started mapping the remote deserts of what is now Pakistan. Explorers and archaeologists traveling through the Cholistan region recorded the fortress as one of the most striking structures in the desert landscape. The early photographs and survey notes describe the fort's extraordinary scale and unusual isolation. Even seasoned explorers accustomed to ancient ruins were struck by the sheer improbability of its location. Standing in the middle of an arid wilderness with no permanent river nearby, Derawar appeared less like a city's defensive wall and more like a solitary monument planted deliberately in the desert. The architecture of Derawar Fort reinforces this sense of deliberate monumental design. The fortress forms an almost perfect square, with each side stretching roughly half a kilometer. At each corner, and at regular intervals along the walls, stand enormous circular bastions, 40 in total, rising nearly 30 meters above the surrounding sands. These bastions create a repeating rhythm of shadows and curves across the walls, and giving the fortress an appearance that is both elegant and intimidating. Such massive defensive structures were typical of major fortifications protecting wealthy cities or strategic trade routes, yet Derawar sits in a region that today appears almost completely empty. This contradiction has become one of the central mysteries surrounding the fortress. Why would medieval rulers invest immense resources into constructing such a gigantic defensive complex in the heart of a desert? One possible explanation lies beneath the sands themselves. Archaeological surveys across the Cholistan Desert have revealed the remains of hundreds of ancient settlements associated with the Indus Valley civilization. Thousands of years ago, this landscape was far from barren. Archaeological evidence suggests that an ancient river system, often linked to the legendary Sarasvati or Hakra River, once flowed through the region. If true, the desert surrounding Derawar may once have supported thriving communities and agricultural networks. If the Hakra River once flowed near this site, Derawar Fort may have stood along an important corridor connecting the Indus Valley to the trade routes of Central Asia and northern India. In that context, the fortress could have functioned as a critical military checkpoint, guarding caravans, taxation routes, or frontier territories. The desert we see today might therefore conceal the traces of a far more complex historical landscape, one in which Derawar was not isolated at all, but instead positioned at the crossroads of regional power and commerce. Yet even with this explanation, several puzzles remain. The design of the fortress suggests careful planning and a deep understanding of defensive engineering. The circular bastions are not merely decorative. Their shape distributes impact from siege weapons and allows defenders to observe attackers approaching from multiple angles. The thick brick walls were constructed to withstand both assault and the harsh desert climate. Maintaining such a fortress would have required a reliable water supply, food storage, and a permanent garrison capable of surviving in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Inside the fortress complex, archaeologists have identified wells and internal structures that may have supported long-term habitation. These features hint that Derawar was more than a simple outpost. It may have functioned as a fortified settlement capable of sustaining life during extended military campaigns or periods of regional instability. Even so, the surrounding desert still lacks clear evidence of the large population centers that would normally justify such monumental fortifications. Comparisons with other great desert fortresses help illustrate this mystery. Across the Middle East and Central Asia, powerful empires built remote strongholds to control trade routes and protect frontier territories. Fortresses such as those along the Silk Road or the desert citadels of Iran served similar strategic purposes. Yet most of those fortifications were integrated into larger networks of settlements, caravanserais, and irrigation systems. Derawar, by contrast, appears strikingly solitary. Its walls dominate the desert, not as part of a larger urban complex, but as a monumental presence, standing almost alone against the horizon. In this sense, Derawar Fort shares a curious resemblance with other enigmatic desert monuments scattered across the ancient world. Massive fortifications rise from barren landscapes in places like Jordan, Iran, and the Arabian Peninsula, structures whose original contexts have been partly erased by shifting climates and migrating rivers. These monuments remind historians that landscapes are not static. What appears desolate today may once have been fertile and densely populated. Another layer of intrigue surrounds the possibility that the current fortress sits atop even older foundations. Some architectural elements within the walls suggest multiple construction phases, and indicating that Derawar may have been rebuilt repeatedly over centuries. If earlier fortifications existed on the same site, they could point to a much longer history of strategic importance than written records alone reveal. Unfortunately, large-scale archaeological excavations inside the fortress have been limited, leaving many questions unanswered. Today, Derawar Fort remains one of the most dramatic and least explored architectural landmarks in Pakistan. Its towering bastions still cast long shadows across the Cholistan sands, standing as silent witnesses to centuries of political change, shifting trade routes, and environmental transformation. For historians and archaeologists, the fortress offers a powerful reminder that even well-known monuments can conceal deeper stories waiting to be uncovered. In the end, Derawar Fort may represent more than a medieval military structure. It may be the last visible remnant of a landscape that has largely vanished, a frontier city, a trade corridor, or a defensive network erased by time and desert winds. Until further archaeological research reveals more of its buried past, the fortress will continue to stand as both a monument and a mystery. Rising alone from the desert, Derawar Fort invites us to imagine the world that once surrounded it, and to wonder how many other forgotten histories still lie hidden beneath the sands of Cholistan. On the small Mediterranean island of Gozo, rising quietly above the surrounding countryside, stand the ruins of structures so ancient that they challenge our assumptions about early human civilization. Massive limestone blocks form curved walls that have endured for more than 5 millennia, their weathered surfaces silently witnessing thousands of years of history. Known today as the Ggantija temples, this prehistoric complex represents one of the oldest freestanding monumental structures on Earth. Built long before the pyramids of Egypt or the stone circles of northern Europe, the temples raise a profound question. How did a small Neolithic society, living on a remote island in the Mediterranean, create architectural monuments of such scale, precision, and complexity? The story of the temple's rediscovery begins in the early 19th century. Although the ruins had been known to local farmers for generations, they were long surrounded by legend rather than scientific investigation. The site's name itself comes from the Maltese word Ggant, meaning giant, reflecting a long-standing folk belief that only beings of enormous strength could have built such colossal structures. According to local legend, a giantess named Sunsuna constructed the temple while carrying her child on her shoulder, assembling the massive stones in a single night. While the myth speaks more to imagination than history, it hints at a genuine puzzle. Even today, the scale of the stones seems astonishing for a society that lived thousands of years before metal tools or advanced engineering. The first documented archaeological interest in the site emerged in the early 1800s, when Maltese scholars began to recognize the significance of the ruins scattered across the Gozo landscape. In 1827, British colonial authorities ordered a formal clearing of the area, removing accumulated soil and debris that had buried much of the structure over the centuries. As the excavations progressed, the true scale of the complex gradually emerged. What appeared at first to be a simple collection of large stones revealed itself to be a carefully designed temple structure, with curved chambers, central corridors, and monumental entranceways constructed from enormous limestone blocks. Later, archaeological studies in the 20th century refined the dating of the complex, placing its construction between roughly 3600 and 3200 BCE, deep within Malta's Neolithic temple-building culture. What archaeologists uncovered was not a single building, but a complex of two adjoining temples sharing a common boundary wall. Each temple follows a distinctive architectural plan characteristic of prehistoric Maltese religious sites. Visitors entering the complex pass through a monumental stone doorway into a central passage that leads to a series of semicircular chambers, known as apses. These chambers are arranged symmetrically on either side of the central corridor, creating a layout that resembles the petals of a clover or the branching structure of a tree. Within these chambers, archaeologists discovered altars, carved stone blocks, and fragments of decorative elements suggesting that ritual ceremonies once took place inside these spaces. Yet the true mystery of Ggantija lies not only in its age, but in its construction. The outer walls of the temples are composed of massive limestone megaliths, some weighing more than 20 tons and standing over 5 meters tall. These stones were quarried, transported, and carefully positioned thousands of years ago by a society that possessed neither iron tools nor wheeled vehicles. Even bronze metallurgy had not yet appeared in the region. The people who built Ggantija lived in an era defined primarily by stone tools, wooden implements, and human labor. How such enormous stones were moved remains one of the most debated questions in Mediterranean archaeology, and some researchers suggest that the builders used spherical stone rollers discovered near the site, possibly functioning as primitive bearings that allowed heavy blocks to be rolled across the ground. Others propose that large wooden sledges combined with earthen ramps and coordinated human labor could have gradually shifted the stones into position. Yet despite decades of experimentation, no reconstruction has fully demonstrated how a relatively small prehistoric community could have transported and erected stones of such immense weight with the limited technology available at the time. Inside the temples, archaeological discoveries reveal clues about the beliefs of the people who built them. Excavations uncovered animal bones, pottery fragments, and small figurines that appear to represent stylized human forms. And some of these figurines are interpreted as fertility symbols, suggesting that the temples may have been dedicated to rituals associated with agricultural cycles, seasonal renewal, or the worship of a mother goddess figure. The curved chambers themselves may have served as ritual spaces where ceremonies were performed, offerings were placed, and communal gatherings were held. Yet because the builders left behind no written language, these interpretations remain hypotheses rather than confirmed explanations. When viewed in a broader historical context, Ggantija becomes even more extraordinary. Its construction predates some of the most famous ancient monuments in the world. The Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, for example, would not rise above the desert sands until nearly 1,000 years after the temples of Gozo were already standing. The earliest phases of Stonehenge in Britain were also built centuries later. In other words, at a time when many societies were still developing early forms of agriculture and village life, the inhabitants of Malta were already constructing large ceremonial complexes from enormous stone blocks. Malta itself is remarkable for the number of prehistoric temples scattered across its islands. Sites such as Hagar Kim, Mnajdra, and Tarxian reveal that Ggantija was part of a much broader cultural tradition of temple construction that flourished in the Maltese archipelago for over 1,000 years. These temples share similar architectural layouts and symbolic elements, suggesting that the builders possessed a well-developed system of religious beliefs and construction knowledge passed down through generations. Yet despite the sophistication of their architecture, this temple-building culture eventually vanished. Around 2500 BCE, the Maltese temple civilization appears to have declined abruptly. Archaeological layers from this period suggest a sudden break in cultural continuity. The construction of large temples ceased, artistic traditions changed, and the communities responsible for these monumental structures disappeared from the historical record. Scholars have proposed several explanations for this collapse. Environmental changes, including soil exhaustion and deforestation, may have undermined the island's agricultural stability. Others suggest that shifts in climate or the arrival of new populations could have disrupted the existing social structure. But the exact cause remains unknown. Today, the Ggantija temples stand not only as a testament to prehistoric engineering, but also as a symbol of one of the earliest known architectural traditions in human history. Their massive stone walls continue to dominate the landscape of Gozo, reminding visitors that complex societies and monumental architecture existed far earlier than many people once believed. More than 5,000 years after their construction, the temples still invite the same question that once inspired legends of giants. How did a small island society, armed with little more than stone tools and collective effort, create monuments capable of surviving the ages? Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ggantija is that despite more than a century of archaeological research, many of its deepest secrets remain unsolved. The techniques used to transport its stones are still debated. The precise rituals performed within its chambers remain uncertain. Even the fate of the civilization that built it continues to puzzle historians. High on the windswept plateau of the Andes, where the thin air of the Altiplano stretches toward the horizon, lie the scattered remains of one of the most puzzling stone complexes in the ancient world. At first glance, the ruins appear chaotic. Massive blocks of stone lying toppled across the ground as though a monumental structure had been shattered long ago. Yet among these ruins are objects so precise, so geometrically deliberate, that they continue to challenge our understanding of ancient engineering. These are the famous H-blocks of Puma Punku, a site connected to the powerful Tiwanaku civilization that flourished near Lake Titicaca between roughly 500 and 1000 CE. To archaeologists, Puma Punku is not merely a ruin. It is a technological puzzle carved in stone, one that raises profound questions about how ancient builders conceived, shaped, and assembled materials on a scale and with a precision that seems astonishing even today. The ruins of Puma Punku were not unknown to local populations. Indigenous communities in the region had long been aware of the massive stones scattered across the plateau. However, the site entered the written historical record during the Spanish colonial period. In the 16th century, chroniclers traveling through the Andes described enormous carved stones lying in disarray near the larger ceremonial center of Tiwanaku. One of the earliest detailed references came from the Spanish chronicler Pedro Chiesa de León, and who visited the region in the mid-16th century while documenting the landscapes and cultures of the Andes. He described massive stones that appeared far too large to have been moved by ordinary means, and noted that local traditions attributed the ruins to a civilization far older than the Inca. For centuries afterward, the site remained largely unexplored by science. It was not until the 19th and early 20th centuries that systematic archaeological interest began to emerge. Explorers, engineers, and early archaeologists traveling through Bolivia encountered the site and were struck by the unusual shapes of many of the stones. Among them were the distinctive blocks carved into forms resembling the letter H, geometric modules unlike anything previously documented in pre-Columbian architecture. By the early 20th century, archaeological studies led by scholars such as Arthur Posnansky began documenting the ruins in detail. Posnansky and others measured the stones, mapped their positions, and attempted to reconstruct the original layout of the complex. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. The H-blocks are among the most distinctive elements at Puma Punku. Carved primarily from andesite, a dense volcanic stone, each block features a series of precise angles, stepped recesses, and symmetrical grooves that together form a shape resembling the letter H. What makes these stones extraordinary is not only their geometry, but their consistency. Many of the blocks appear to follow the same design pattern, with proportions that repeat across multiple stones. This suggests that the builders were not shaping stones randomly to fit specific spaces. Instead, they may have been producing standardized architectural components, something akin to a modular building system. Such an approach is strikingly unusual in ancient stone architecture. Most ancient builders shaped stones individually to fit their position in a wall or structure. At Puma Punku, however, the repeating geometry hints at a level of architectural planning that feels surprisingly systematic. When archaeologists and engineers began studying the H-blocks closely, they noticed something even more remarkable. The surfaces of many stones are extremely flat, while the internal corners of their recesses form sharp, nearly perfect right angles. Modern measurements show that some cuts deviate by only a few millimeters across large surfaces. Achieving such precision is challenging even with modern stone-cutting tools. And yet the Tiwanaku culture is not believed to have possessed iron or steel tools. Their known toolkits consisted largely of stone hammers, chisels made from copper alloys, and abrasive techniques using sand or harder minerals. Andesite, however, is a relatively hard volcanic rock, making it difficult to shape with softer metals. How these precise surfaces and sharp geometric forms were achieved remains a matter of debate. Some archaeologists suggest extremely patient grinding and polishing techniques. Others propose that specialized stone tools made from even harder materials may have been used. But despite decades of study, no consensus fully explains the remarkable uniformity of the H-blocks. Another striking feature of many stones at Puma Punku is the presence of clamp-shaped grooves carved into their surfaces. These grooves appear to have held metal connectors that once locked adjacent stones together. Fragments of these connectors have been found and analyzed. They were made from copper alloys containing arsenic or nickel. Molten metal would have been poured into the carved grooves, forming clamps that secured neighboring blocks tightly together. This technique is not unique to Tiwanaku. Similar metal clamps were used in ancient Mediterranean architecture, including Greek temples and certain Roman constructions. Yet the presence of this technology in the Andes raises intriguing questions about the independent development of engineering solutions across distant civilizations. At Puma Punku, the clamp grooves themselves are cut with remarkable regularity, suggesting careful planning and standardized design. Well, perhaps the most dramatic mystery surrounding Puma Punku concerns the transportation of its stones. Some of the sandstone blocks at the site weigh more than 100 tons, while the andesite blocks, though smaller, still represent enormous logistical challenges. Geological studies suggest that the andesite may have been quarried from locations several kilometers away, possibly near volcanic outcrops around Lake Titicaca. Transporting stones of this size across the rugged Andean plateau would have required an immense labor force and sophisticated planning. The Tiwanaku civilization is not believed to have used the wheel for heavy transport, nor did they possess large draft animals capable of pulling massive loads. Researchers have proposed several possibilities, including sledges dragged across prepared surfaces, wooden rollers, or seasonal movement across wetlands or frozen ground. Yet, the precise methods remain uncertain. Comparisons with other ancient engineering traditions. When scholars compare Puma Punku with other ancient sites, intriguing parallels emerge. The precision stonework of Puma Punku is often compared with the polygonal masonry of the Inca at sites like Sacsayhuaman, where massive stones were fitted together with extraordinary accuracy. However, Inca stones are usually irregularly shaped to interlock organically, whereas the H-blocks of Puma Punku appear intentionally geometric and modular. Elsewhere in the world, massive stone construction appears in places such as Baalbek, where enormous blocks were moved and assembled in Roman temples. Yet the technological and cultural contexts differ dramatically. These comparisons highlight an important point. Throughout history, different civilizations developed unique solutions to similar engineering challenges. Puma Punku represents the Andean expression of that ingenuity, yet one whose exact techniques have yet to be fully understood. Long before the rise of the great cities of ancient Mexico, before the monumental avenues of Teotihuacan dominated the Valley of Mexico, and centuries before the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan emerged from the waters of Lake Texcoco, another city once stood here. It was older, quieter, and today almost forgotten beneath a vast ocean of black volcanic stone. At the southern edge of modern Mexico City lies Cuicuilco, an ancient settlement whose history stretches back more than 2,000 years. From the air, its most striking feature is immediately visible: a massive circular pyramid rising slowly from a landscape of hardened lava. The structure looks unlike almost anything else in the ancient Americas. Yet what makes Cuicuilco truly fascinating is not only what archaeologists have discovered, but what remains hidden beneath the lava fields that surround it. The modern story of Cuicuilco began in the early 20th century, when archaeologists first realized that the strange mound protruding from the lava fields of southern Mexico City was not a natural formation at all. Early scientific attention was drawn to the site during excavations in the 1920s, particularly through the work of Mexican archaeologist Manuel Gamio, one of the pioneers of modern archaeology in Mexico. Gamio and his team began carefully investigating the area after noticing fragments of pottery, stone tools, and architectural remains emerging from beneath the volcanic terrain known as the Pedregal Lava Field. As excavations progressed, they revealed something unexpected: an enormous circular pyramid constructed of volcanic stone, layered in concentric terraces that gradually rose toward a flattened summit. The discovery was remarkable, not only because of the scale of the structure, but because of its unusual design. Most pyramids across Mesoamerica were built with square bases and sharply defined stairways aligned with cardinal directions. Cuicuilco's pyramid, by contrast, was almost perfectly circular, giving it the appearance of a low, stepped cone. Radiocarbon dating and archaeological analysis soon suggested that Cuicuilco was far older than many of the great cities that later dominated central Mexico. The city appears to have flourished between roughly 700 BCE and 200 BCE, during the formative period of Mesoamerican civilization. At its height, the settlement may have supported a population of 20 to 40,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest urban centers in the Valley of Mexico at the time. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of residential compounds, ceremonial plazas, and complex layers of construction that indicated the city had grown gradually over centuries. The pyramid itself was likely expanded multiple times, each generation adding new layers of stone over earlier structures, gradually transforming the monument into the massive circular platform that survives today. Yet even as archaeologists began to reconstruct the history of Cuicuilco, they encountered a mystery that still defines the site. Surrounding nearly the entire city is a vast expanse of hardened volcanic lava. This lava originated from the eruption of the nearby Zittel volcano, a relatively small but devastating volcano located just south of the ancient settlement. At some point near the end of Cuicuilco's occupation, Zittel erupted violently, sending rivers of molten basalt across the landscape. These flows eventually engulfed much of the surrounding region, burying large portions of the city beneath thick layers of volcanic rock. Unlike the ash that preserved the Roman city of Pompeii in extraordinary detail, the lava of Zittel hardened into dense stone that permanently sealed off most of the ancient settlement. As a result, only fragments of Cuicuilco remain visible today, while the majority of the city likely still lies hidden beneath the Pedregal lava field. This catastrophic eruption has become one of the central mysteries surrounding Cuicuilco. Archaeologists continue to debate exactly when the eruption occurred and how it affected the city's inhabitants. And some evidence suggests that the eruption forced a sudden abandonment of the settlement, driving thousands of people to migrate northward across the valley. Intriguingly, this period coincides with the early rise of Teotihuacan, the massive metropolis that would later become the dominant power in central Mexico. Some researchers have proposed that refugees from Cuicuilco may have contributed to the population and cultural development of Teotihuacan, potentially transferring architectural ideas, religious traditions, and urban planning concepts to the new city. If this hypothesis is correct, Cuicuilco may represent a forgotten precursor to one of the greatest civilizations in ancient Mesoamerica. Another mystery lies in the unusual architecture of Cuicuilco's pyramid itself. Circular pyramids are extremely rare across the ancient Americas. In most ceremonial platforms were constructed with square or rectangular bases, often aligned carefully with astronomical events or cardinal directions. Yet the builders of Cuicuilco chose a dramatically different design. Some archaeologists believe the circular form may have symbolized a sacred mountain or cosmological concept associated with cycles of time and nature. Others suggest it may have been linked to early forms of ritual associated with wind deities or agricultural fertility. Centuries later, circular temples dedicated to the wind god Ggantija would appear in Aztec architecture, raising the intriguing possibility that Cuicuilco's design reflects an early version of a religious tradition that persisted for more than a millennium. Comparisons with other early Mesoamerican sites further highlight the uniqueness of Cuicuilco. During roughly the same era, the Olmec civilization was constructing monumental stone sculptures and ceremonial centers at sites such as La Venta along the Gulf Coast. Meanwhile, early urban settlements were beginning to emerge across the highlands of central Mexico. Yet few of these sites display the same combination of large-scale urban planning, monumental architecture, and distinctive circular design found at Cuicuilco. In many ways, the city appears to represent an experimental phase in the development of complex societies in the region, a moment when early civilizations were still exploring different architectural and cultural traditions before later standard forms became dominant. Today, Cuicuilco stands at the edge of one of the largest cities in the world, surrounded by highways, modern buildings, and sprawling suburbs. Yet beneath this urban landscape may lie the buried remains of an entire ancient metropolis. The lava that once destroyed the city also preserved its deeper layers, sealing them away for more than 2,000 years. Each excavation uncovers only small fragments of a much larger story, hinting at plazas, homes, and temples that may still remain hidden underground. For archaeologists, Cuicuilco is both a discovery and a question mark, a city whose influence may have shaped the early history of Mesoamerica, yet whose true scale and significance remain only partially understood. In the end, the greatest mystery of Cuicuilco may not be the pyramid that still rises above the lava fields, but the silent city that may still sleep beneath them. Somewhere under the hardened stone of the Pedregal, entire streets and structures could remain untouched, waiting for future discoveries to reveal what this ancient civilization once looked like before the volcano changed its fate forever. High in the eastern foothills of the Andes, where the rugged mountains of South America begin to soften into the forests of the Amazon basin, an enormous stone lies carved with patterns that seem both deliberate and enigmatic. At first glance, it appears to be a natural hill of sandstone, weathered by centuries of wind and rain, but a closer look reveals something extraordinary. Across its surface stretch hundreds of carefully cut channels, terraces, geometric grooves, and sculpted forms. Some resemble flowing rivers frozen in stone. Others resemble animals emerging from the rock itself. Together, they form one of the most unusual archaeological landscapes on Earth. This place is known as El Fuerte de Samaipata, a site whose origins, purpose, and creators continue to challenge archaeologists even today. The site lies in the modern nation of Bolivia, perched more than 1,900 meters above sea level. From this vantage point, the landscape opens outward toward distant valleys and dense forests. The location alone hints that the builders of Samaipata were thinking on a grand scale. Yet what truly distinguishes the site is the colossal sandstone ridge at its center, an immense rock formation measuring roughly 200 meters in length. Archaeologists widely consider it to be the largest carved rock of its kind in the world, its surface transformed into a vast ceremonial canvas by ancient hands. The modern story of Samaipata's discovery begins during the early colonial period. When Spanish explorers moved into the region in the 16th century, they encountered local communities who already knew the place well. The Spaniards referred to the site as El Fuerte, meaning the fortress, believing the ruins around the rock had once served defensive purposes. Over time, the name persisted, even though later research revealed that the stone carvings themselves were likely not military in nature at all. Formal archaeological attention did not arrive until centuries later. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, explorers and researchers began documenting the strange carvings that covered the enormous rock. Among the early investigators were European scholars traveling through the Andes who realized that the site represented something far older and more complex than a colonial outpost. Systematic excavation and study accelerated throughout the 20th century, and gradually revealing layers of history that stretched back more than 1,000 years. One of the first mysteries archaeologists encountered was the sheer scale of the carved rock itself. The sandstone ridge appears almost sculpted into terraces, channels, seats, and symbolic forms. Long parallel grooves run across the surface in carefully measured lines. Elsewhere, the stone dips into smooth basins or rises into raised platforms. Carved figures, most famously a series of stylized jaguars, emerge subtly from the rock. The patterns are too organized to be accidental, yet their overall purpose remains uncertain. Unlike temples or palaces constructed from separate blocks, Samaipata's main monument was carved directly from living stone, turning the landscape itself into architecture. Another striking feature is the network of channels etched across the rock. During rainfall, water flows through these grooves along predetermined routes. Some channels converge into basins, while others branch outward like miniature river systems. Researchers have debated their meaning for decades. One theory suggests that these channels were designed to guide water during ritual ceremonies, transforming rainfall into a symbolic performance across the stone's surface. Another possibility is that the flowing water represented cosmological ideas, perhaps mirroring rivers of the sky or sacred landscapes within local mythologies. Yet despite decades of research, no single explanation fully accounts for the complexity of the system. Complicating the mystery further is the question of who actually created Samaipata. Archaeological evidence suggests that the site was not the product of a single civilization. Instead, it appears to have evolved through multiple cultural phases. The earliest carvings may have been produced by regional cultures long before the rise of the great Andean empires. Later, the expanding empire of the Inca arrived in the region during the 15th century. The Inca appear to have adopted the site as an important administrative and ceremonial center, constructing buildings and plazas around the carved rock. For them, the site may have served as a frontier outpost, marking the eastern limits of their empire, positioned between the high Andes and the tropical lowlands. Yet the Inca were probably not the original creators of the carvings themselves. The deeper layers of the site hint at earlier cultures who had already begun shaping the rock centuries before Inca expansion. This layering of civilizations has made Samaipata extraordinarily difficult to interpret. Archaeologists must disentangle which features belong to which era and how each culture reinterpreted the site's meaning over time. Comparisons with other ancient sites offer some clues, though none provide a perfect parallel. In the Andes, sacred landscapes were often integrated into architecture rather than built over. At places like Machu Picchu, natural rock formations were carved into ceremonial shapes and incorporated into temples. Similarly, at the ceremonial center of Tiwanaku, monumental stone blocks were shaped with extraordinary precision to create ritual spaces aligned with cosmological beliefs. And Samaipata shares elements with both traditions, yet it differs in a crucial way. Instead of shaping individual stones, its builders transformed an entire geological formation into a ritual monument. Some researchers have also proposed that the orientation of certain carvings might relate to astronomical observation. The Andes are rich with ancient sites aligned to the movements of the sun and stars. Structures at places like Chanquillo were designed to track the sun's position throughout the year with remarkable precision. At Samaipata, certain carved lines appear to correspond with the direction of sunrise during specific times of the year. While the evidence is still debated, the possibility raises an intriguing idea that the rock may have served not only as a ceremonial platform, but also as a symbolic map of the cosmos. Despite decades of investigation, however, one fundamental question remains unanswered. Why carve such an enormous monument into soft sandstone? Unlike granite or basalt, sandstone erodes relatively easily under the forces of rain and wind. Over centuries, many of the finer carvings have already softened or disappeared entirely. This suggests that the original monument may once have been even more detailed than what survives today. It also raises the possibility that the builders were less concerned with permanence than with the ritual act of carving itself, transforming the living rock as part of a cultural or spiritual process. Today, the site is recognized globally for its significance. The UNESCO has designated Samaipata a World Heritage Site, acknowledging its importance as a meeting point of cultures and a unique example of ancient landscape architecture. Yet even with modern archaeological techniques, the stone continues to guard many of its secrets. Standing on the surface of the carved ridge, one can see grooves stretching toward the horizon, terraces descending into shadow, and faint animal shapes emerging from the sandstone. The patterns hint at knowledge, symbolism, and intention, but their full meaning has never been recovered. Perhaps they represent ancient cosmology. Perhaps they guided rituals tied to water, fertility, or the cycles of the sky. Or perhaps they belong to traditions whose stories have long since vanished. What remains undeniable is that Samaipata occupies a rare place in the archaeological world. It is neither a typical temple nor a conventional city. Instead, it is something more unusual, a monumental dialogue between humans and the landscape itself. Across centuries of cultural change, different civilizations return to this stone, carving, building, and reshaping its meaning. And even now, after centuries of study, the carved rock of Samaipata continues to challenge our understanding of the ancient world, reminding us that some monuments are not simply structures of stone, but puzzles left behind by history itself. In the vast isolation of the southeastern Pacific Ocean lies one of the most remote inhabited islands on Earth. Known today as Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, the island is famous for its towering stone statues, the moai, which stand silently along the coastline like guardians of a lost civilization. For centuries, these monumental figures have captured the imagination of explorers, archaeologists, and historians alike. Yet among the many archaeological sites scattered across the island, one location stands apart for a very different reason. It is a place where the stonework itself challenges expectations about the technological abilities and cultural connections of ancient societies. This site is Ahu Vinapu, a ceremonial platform located on the southern coast of the island. And at first glance, it appears similar to many other Ahu structures across Rapa Nui, massive stone foundations once used to support rows of moai statues. But a closer look reveals something extraordinary. The stones forming part of the platform are cut and fitted together with a precision rarely seen in Polynesian architecture. Their smooth surfaces and tightly interlocking edges resemble a style of masonry more commonly associated with a civilization thousands of kilometers away in the Andes. The result is one of the most intriguing architectural mysteries in the Pacific world. European awareness of Easter Island began in the year 1722, when Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on the island on Easter Sunday. His expedition recorded the presence of enormous stone statues and scattered ruins, but the island remained largely unexplored archaeologically for nearly 2 centuries. Serious scientific investigation of Rapa Nui began during the 19th and early 20th centuries, when a series of explorers, missionaries, and scholars documented the island's monuments. Among them was Norwegian ethnographer Thor Heyerdahl, whose expedition in the 1950s carried out some of the first systematic excavations of the island's ceremonial platforms. During these excavations, Heyerdahl and his team examined the ruins at Ahu Vinapu in detail. What they found immediately drew attention. Unlike most Ahu structures, which were built from relatively rough stone blocks, the rear wall of Vinapu consisted of carefully shaped basalt slabs fitted together so tightly that even a thin blade could not be inserted between them. The stones were arranged in horizontal courses, each block precisely cut so that its edges aligned perfectly with its neighbors. To Heyerdahl and several other researchers, the construction looked strikingly familiar. The stonework bore a remarkable resemblance to the masonry of the Inca civilization, particularly the walls found in cities such as Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo in modern-day Peru. The comparison raised an astonishing possibility. Could the builders of Easter Island have had contact with civilizations in South America? The defining feature of Ahu Vinapu is the rear retaining wall of the platform, constructed from large basalt blocks shaped and fitted with exceptional care. Each stone appears to have been carefully trimmed to match the contours of its neighbors. Rather than relying on mortar, the builders created stability through the precision of the cuts themselves. This technique is known as ashlar masonry, a construction style in which stones are finely dressed so that they fit together with minimal gaps. While such techniques are found in various ancient cultures, the specific style at Vinapu, with its slightly curved surfaces and carefully aligned horizontal courses, closely resembles Andean stonework. In the Andes, Inca builders developed a highly sophisticated form of stone construction designed to withstand earthquakes. Blocks were shaped so that they interlocked tightly, allowing walls to flex without collapsing during seismic activity. The surfaces of the stones were often polished smooth, and their joints were so precise that they became one of the defining characteristics of Inca architecture. The surprising aspect is that Rapa Nui lies more than 3,700 kilometers west of the South American coastline. The island was settled by Polynesian voyagers who arrived from the Western Pacific, not from the Andes. Yet here, on one isolated platform on Easter Island, appears a stone wall that seems to echo a completely different architectural tradition. Another element that deepens the mystery is how unusual the construction of Vinapu is compared with other structures on the island. Most Ahu platforms on Rapa Nui were built using irregular blocks of volcanic stone stacked together with far less precision. These foundations served primarily as ceremonial stages for moai statues and were constructed using techniques typical of Polynesian stone building. Vinapu, however, stands apart. Its masonry is significantly more refined than that of most other platforms on the island. The stones are larger, smoother, and fitted with greater care. In fact, archaeologists often describe Vinapu as the closest example of Inca-like masonry found anywhere in Polynesia. This raises an important question. If the Rapa Nui people possessed the knowledge to construct such precise stonework, why does the technique appear only rarely in their architecture? Several hypotheses have been proposed to explain the similarities between Vinapu and Andean masonry. One theory suggests that the resemblance is purely coincidental, that different cultures can independently develop similar construction methods when faced with similar engineering challenges. Stone masonry, after all, follows certain practical principles, and it is possible that the builders of Rapa Nui simply discovered an effective technique through experimentation. Another theory proposes that there may have been contact between Polynesian sailors and South American civilizations before European exploration of the Pacific. Polynesians were among the most skilled navigators in human history, capable of traveling vast distances across open ocean, using stars, currents, and wave patterns as guides. Some genetic studies have even suggested limited prehistoric interaction between Polynesian populations and indigenous peoples of South America. Additionally, crops such as the sweet potato, native to the Andes, were present in Polynesia centuries before European arrival. However, no direct archaeological evidence has yet confirmed that Inca or other South American builders ever traveled to Easter Island. Another puzzle surrounding Ahu Vinapu concerns the tools available to its builders. The inhabitants of Rapa Nui did not possess metal tools when the Ahu platforms were constructed. Instead, they relied primarily on stone implements made from basalt and other volcanic materials. Shaping large blocks of stone with such tools would have required tremendous labor and patience. Yet the surfaces of the Vinapu stones appear remarkably smooth, and their edges fit together with extraordinary accuracy. How these stones were shaped so precisely using relatively simple tools remains an open question. Some researchers suggest that careful grinding and repeated abrasion using harder stones may have been sufficient, though the exact techniques are still debated. Beyond its masonry, Ahu Vinapu was part of a broader ceremonial complex. Archaeological excavations have revealed cremation sites and ritual features associated with the platform, indicating that the location likely held significant spiritual importance. Originally, Moai statues probably stood atop the platform facing inland, watching over the community as symbols of ancestral authority. Over time, however, many of these statues were toppled during periods of social upheaval on the island. Today, only the stone foundations remain, silent reminders of a once vibrant ceremonial tradition. Ahu Vinapu occupies a unique place in the archaeological landscape of Easter Island. It is not the largest platform on the island, nor does it display the most dramatic statues. Instead, its mystery lies in the quiet precision of its stonework, a wall whose craftsmanship seems unexpectedly familiar to archaeologists studying a completely different continent. Was this simply an example of parallel innovation, where different cultures arrived at similar engineering solutions independently? Or does Vinapu hint at forgotten voyages across the Pacific, long before the age of European exploration? Across the landscape of southern Florida, hidden among palm trees and limestone plains, stands a structure that appears strangely out of place. Massive stone blocks, weighing several tons, are arranged into walls, towers, gates, and monuments that resemble fragments of an ancient megalithic complex. Visitors often compare it to prehistoric sites scattered across the world, places where enormous stones were moved and shaped with techniques that seem far beyond what simple tools should allow. Yet this structure is not thousands of years old. It was built in the 20th century. Even more astonishing, it was constructed almost entirely by a single man. This place is known as Coral Castle, and despite decades of study, the story behind its construction continues to puzzle engineers, historians, and archaeologists alike. The creator of Coral Castle was Edward Leedskalnin, a Latvian immigrant who arrived in the United States in the early 20th century. Born in 1887 in what is now Latvia, Leedskalnin lived a quiet and solitary life. He was physically small, barely 1 meter and 50 centimeters tall, and weighed less than 50 kilograms. Yet sometime during the 1920s, he began working on a project that would eventually involve moving and carving more than 1,000 tons of stone. The story begins around 1923, when Leedskalnin settled in a remote area of Florida City. There, on a patch of land surrounded by mangroves and coral limestone bedrock, he quietly started quarrying stone. The material he used was oolitic limestone, a type of fossilized coral common in southern Florida. Although softer than granite, the stone still forms massive, dense blocks that can weigh several tons each. Neighbors soon noticed something unusual. Over time, towering stone walls began to appear, where previously there had been nothing but open land. Gigantic slabs rose upright, some reaching several meters high. Tables, chairs, arches, and sculptures carved from solid rock slowly filled the property. The entire complex seemed to grow piece by piece, but no one ever saw exactly how it was being built. Leedskalnin worked almost entirely at night, often alone and behind closed gates. When curious locals tried to watch him work, he reportedly stopped until they left. As a result, Very few witnesses ever saw the actual construction process. When people asked how he managed to move stones weighing up to 30 tons by himself, Ggantija gave only mysterious answers. On several occasions, he claimed that he had discovered the secrets of the pyramids. Over the next 28 years, the structure expanded into a carefully organized stone complex. The site eventually included high perimeter walls, massive stone furniture, towers, carvings of planets and stars, and even a large sundial. One of the most remarkable features was a rotating stone gate, weighing approximately 9 tons. The gate was so precisely balanced on its central axis that visitors could reportedly push it open with just one finger. Decades later, when the mechanism failed and engineers attempted to repair it, cranes and heavy equipment were required to remove the stone. Inside, they discovered a carefully drilled vertical shaft containing a metal pivot and bearings, components that raised even more questions about how Ggantija had installed them without modern machinery. Perhaps the greatest mystery surrounding Coral Castle lies in the method of construction. No photographs or reliable records exist showing the stones being lifted or placed. Some witnesses reported seeing simple wooden tripods, chains, and pulley systems on the property, suggesting that Ggantija relied on basic mechanical principles such as leverage and balance. However, even with these tools, many engineers struggle to explain how a single individual with limited resources could repeatedly move blocks weighing several tons with such precision. Rumors soon began to spread through the local community. Children claimed they had seen stones moving through the air as if they were floating. Others believed Ggantija had discovered some form of anti-gravity or magnetic technology. These stories were likely exaggerated, yet they contributed to the legend surrounding the site. Ggantija himself encouraged the mystery by publishing small pamphlets about magnetism and cosmic energy, suggesting that he believed the universe operated according to hidden forces that science had not yet fully understood. Beyond the mechanics of moving stone, the layout of Coral Castle contains several elements that hint at deeper planning. Some structures appear to align with astronomical directions. A stone telescope-like structure is oriented toward Polaris, the North Star, while other monuments correspond roughly with cardinal directions. The site also includes carvings representing the sun, moon, and planets, suggesting that Ggantija had a strong interest in astronomy and geometry. While these alignments are not as precise as those found in ancient observatories, they add another layer of intrigue to the complex. When viewed from a broader historical perspective, Coral Castle invites comparisons with much older megalithic traditions. Across the world, ancient civilizations constructed monuments using enormous stones, the trilithons of Baalbek in Lebanon, the polygonal masonry of the Inca in Peru, and the standing stones of Stonehenge in Britain. In each of these cases, archaeologists have debated how ancient builders transported and positioned such massive materials using relatively simple technology. Coral Castle mirrors this same puzzle, but in a modern setting where the builder's lifetime overlapped with the age of industrial machinery. Unlike prehistoric sites, however, Coral Castle was not built by a large, organized workforce. It was the work of a single individual, driven by a deeply personal motivation. According to Ggantija, the entire structure was dedicated to a woman he called Sweet 16. She had once been his fiancée in Latvia, but cancelled their wedding shortly before it was to take place. Heartbroken, Ggantija emigrated to America, and many believe Coral Castle became his lifelong tribute to lost love. Ggantija continued working on the monument until his death in 1951. By that time, the complex had already become a curiosity, attracting visitors from across the region. After his passing, the property was opened to the public. and Coral Castle gradually became one of Florida's most famous historical attractions. Yet even as tourists explored its stone corridors and monuments, the central mystery remained unresolved. Today, engineers generally agree that the structure could theoretically have been built using simple mechanical tools such as pulleys, levers, and counterweights. However, replicating the exact process remains difficult, particularly given the precision with which many stones were placed and balanced. Without detailed documentation from Leedskalnin himself, the true sequence of techniques may never be fully known. What makes Coral Castle so fascinating is that it blurs the line between modern engineering and ancient mystery. Unlike prehistoric monuments whose builders are lost to time, we know the name of the man responsible for this one. We know where he lived, when he worked, and what tools he likely possessed. Yet despite this knowledge, the details of how he achieved his remarkable construction remain elusive. Standing among the towering stone walls today, visitors often experience the same feeling that archaeologists encounter at ancient sites, a sense that behind the visible structure lies a hidden story of ingenuity and determination. Whether Coral Castle represents an extraordinary example of mechanical skill, an unconventional understanding of physics, or simply the relentless persistence of a solitary builder, it continues to remind us that human creativity can sometimes produce wonders that seem almost impossible.